A boy sat beside a bull in complete silence. Minutes later, the entire village was in tears. What happens next will leave you speechless. The great bull lay sprawled beneath the oak tree, his sides rising and falling with a slow, uneven rhythm. His body shuddered with each breath, and the ground beneath him trembled faintly whenever he exhaled. Around him, men stood in hushed clusters, their voices lowered as though afraid to disturb the final moments of a creature they had long considered untouchable. The air was heavy, not just with the weight of death, but with a silence that felt unnatural for a village that usually thrummed with the sounds of work and laughter. Callan's small feet pressed into the dirt as he pushed forward through the circle of villagers. His brown tunic was worn and dust-stained, his hair falling untidily into his eyes, but his focus never wavered from the bull. His heart thumped against his ribs, not from fear, but from a strange urgency he could not name. Bramble's great black form, once towering and proud, now seemed to shrink before him, the beast's muscles twitching as if even lying still demanded too much. "Callan!" a voice barked from behind. His father, Bram, was moving quickly, his tall frame cutting through the crowd. The man's face was stern, as always, though beneath the hard lines was something else. Concern, sharpened with the helplessness of a farmer watching his strongest ally fade away. "Stay back, boy. This isn't the place for you." But Callan shook his head and kept walking. His bare feet scuffed against the dry soil as he approached the oak's shade. The murmurs of the men grew louder, some scoffing at his boldness, others falling quiet as if waiting for disaster. "He'll crush you if he moves," one of the older farmers muttered, his voice tight with worry. "He won't," Callan answered softly, not even turning his head. His voice was thin, yet it carried. Something about the certainty in it hushed the whispers, if only for a moment. The boy crouched low beside the bull. Bramble's massive eye rolled toward him, glassy with fatigue but still carrying a glint of recognition. Callan's small hand reached out and pressed against the bull's coarse hide. The heat of Bramble's body seeped into his palm, the faint tremor of muscle twitching beneath. And then, something remarkable happened. The bull's shuddering eased. His labored breaths steadied, if only slightly. The crowd, which had been holding itself taut with fear, released a collective gasp. Callan leaned closer, his lips moving but his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here," he murmured, as speaking to an old friend instead of an animal many considered half-wild. "You're not alone." The bull released a low, rumbling sound, half-groan, half-sigh, that resonated through the air. It wasn't the sound of rage they all feared, but of something gentler, almost sorrowful. The boy pressed his forehead lightly against the bull's shoulder, closing his eyes. Behind them, Bram's jaw tightened. He wanted to call his son back, to drag him away from danger, but something in the scene stopped him. Callan's presence, against all reason, was easing the creature's suffering in a way no man's rope or hand ever could. The men began whispering again. Some marveled at the bond unfolding before them. Others scoffed, dismissing it as coincidence. Yet not all were focused on Callan. Two of the elder farmers, Merrick, whose beard had long since turned white, and Halden, whose weathered face carried the scars of decades in the fields, watched with narrow eyes. They exchanged a glance, silent but heavy with meaning. Merrick's lips pressed into a thin line. His gaze flicked from Bramble's weakened form to the boy kneeling beside him. Halden shifted uneasily, his arms crossing over his chest as if bracing against a truth neither of them wanted to speak aloud. "What's wrong with him?" one of the younger men asked, breaking the uneasy quiet. "It's his time, isn't it? The beast has worked too many years. 15 winters, they say. No animal lasts forever." Halden's mouth opened, then shut again. He looked at Merrick, who gave a slight shake of his head, silencing whatever words might have followed. But Callan noticed the flicker of exchange. Even with his focus on Bramble, he caught the way the elder's eyes avoided the bull too deliberately. He pressed his hand harder against the animal's side, listening to the uneven thrum of its heartbeat, and whispered, "It isn't just age, is it?" No one answered him. Instead, the crowd shifted, unease stirring like a restless wind. Some of the men began drifting back, muttering about tending their fields, unwilling to watch any longer. Others stayed, drawn by the strange calm that had settled between the boy and the bull. Bram stepped closer, his boots crunching against the dry soil. His voice was steady but tinged with something that betrayed his worry. "Callan, you shouldn't say things you don't understand. Sometimes the earth takes back what it gave. That's the way of it." But the boy lifted his face, meeting his father's gaze with quiet defiance. His eyes, usually downcast and shy, burned with something Bram had never seen before. "No, father. He's trying to tell us something." Bram froze, the words striking deeper than he expected. Around them, the other men fell silent again, caught between skepticism and unease. Bram's hand twitched at his side, as if he wanted to reach for his son, but knew it would break the fragile calm. His voice dropped low, rough with a mix of warning and fear. "Respect him, but remember he's still a beast." "I do," Callan whispered, turning back to Bramble. He rested his cheek against the bull's thick hide, feeling the tremors ripple beneath. "That's why I'm listening." The moment stretched on, heavy with tension. The sun dipped behind a passing cloud, casting the scene in muted shadow. A breeze rustled the oak's branches, scattering leaves that drifted down like fragments of time itself. Every man standing there felt the weight of something larger than death settling over them, though none could name it. And through it all, Merrick and Halden remained still, their silence louder than any voice. They knew the truth of what ailed the bull, but to speak it now, before the boy, felt cruel. Still, their uneasy glances betrayed more than words could hide. The crowd shifted again, waiting for someone to act, for someone to declare what should be done. Yet no one dared step forward. All eyes remained on the boy and the bull, locked in a fragile, unspoken bond that seemed both impossible and undeniable. And in that moment, when Bramble's trembling slowed beneath the boy's touch, the weight of silence pressed down on Dunswell harder than any storm. What no one noticed was that two of the elder farmers exchanged worried glances, because Bramble was not just dying from age. They knew something else was happening, something they dared not speak aloud in front of the boy. Bramble's body lurched. The sound of his hooves scraping against the earth shattered the stillness beneath the oak tree, and the villagers, who had been standing frozen in their grief, gasped as one. Dust lifted in the air as the bull strained, his muscles rippling weakly beneath his dark hide. Callan, still kneeling at his side, tightened his hand on Bramble's coarse fur, his heart leaping to his throat. The boy's breath caught, not in fear but in something closer to understanding. He pressed his cheek to the bull's neck and whispered, "I'm here." The great beast let out a low rumble, a sound so deep it trembled through Callan's chest. It wasn't rage, it wasn't pain, it was something softer, almost like a plea. Men who had worked the fields their whole lives, hardened by storms and scars, felt tears prick their eyes. They had never heard Bramble's voice sound so human. "Get him back!" someone shouted, fear cutting through awe. A few men rushed forward, arms outstretched, motioning for Callan to retreat. "The beast's in his death throes. He'll crush you if he rises." But the boy did not move. His small frame stood in stark contrast to Bramble's massive bulk, yet there was no hesitation in him. His hand remained firm against the bull's hide, his dark eyes burning with conviction. "He's not angry," Callan said, his voice clear and steady despite the tension tightening around him. "He's asking for something." The words stilled them all. Bram, standing just beyond the circle, clenched his fists. He wanted to drag his son away, yet something in Callan's tone, something so sure and unyielding, stopped him. He muttered under his breath, "What are you seeing, boy, that the rest of us can't?" Bramble shifted again, his head lifting with a visible struggle. The heavy horns swayed as if they weighed more than the beast could bear. His great eye rolled toward Callan, sharp with intent, despite the sickness that ravaged him. The boy leaned closer, listening as though the bull's strained movements were words only he could understand. Around them, murmurs rippled. "Not natural," one man whispered. "He shouldn't be moving at all." "It's his time," another argued, but his voice trembled. "No animal lasts forever." Yet in the hearts of many, suspicion began to stir. Whispers spread quietly, echoing an unease that had been building for days. Dunswell's harvest had been plentiful this season, greener and fuller than the surrounding valleys. Rivalries were inevitable, but envy could be dangerous. Only a week earlier, Rail, the bitter farmer from beyond the ridge, had been seen lingering near the boundary fields at dusk. Some dismissed it as nothing. Others, remembering his grudges, had wondered. Now, with Bramble's sudden decline, the thought took root. Poison. The word was not spoken aloud, but it slithered into their minds, thick and suffocating. Merrick and Halden, the elders who had exchanged glances earlier, stood grim-faced among the men. Merrick's jaw was locked tight, while Halden's fingers tapped restlessly against his arm. They had heard the whispers before, but to say them aloud now would shatter the fragile quiet. Bramble groaned, his muzzle pressing weakly into the ground. Callan bent lower, his hand brushing along the beast's jaw. For a moment, the boy thought Bramble was simply seeking comfort. But then the bull nudged him, pushing his small hand forward, toward the dirt path that wound down from the oak toward the river. Callan's brows knitted, his heart pounding faster. He turned to the men, his voice breaking the silence with startling clarity. "He wants us to follow." The villagers blinked at him. Some scoffed, shaking their heads in disbelief. "A boy's fancies," one muttered. Another spat into the dirt. "He's delirious." That beast's dying and jerking in madness. Don't put meaning where there is none. But Callan didn't waver. He placed both hands firmly against Bramble's hide, looking straight into the bull's fading eyes. Number he's telling us. He doesn't want to die here. The crowd shifted uneasily. A few of the younger men, less bound by the elder's rigid ways, exchanged glances. They had seen how the bull calmed beneath the boy's touch. They had heard the strange rumble that had sounded more like speech than groan. "What if the lad's right?" one of them whispered, his voice carrying despite his effort to keep it low. "What if the bull's trying to show us something?" Merrick stepped forward, his staff planted firmly in the earth. His voice was measured but heavy with doubt. "And what if he collapses on the path? What then? We lose the beast where the ground is narrow and the water's edge is close. It is dangerous, foolish even." Callan straightened, his small hands curling into fists at his sides. His voice trembled, but it was with determination, not fear. "Then I'll walk with him. If he falls, I'll stay. But I believe him." The stillness that followed was sharp, filled with the weight of choice. Finally, a handful of younger men stepped forward, their eyes hard with resolve. "We'll go with him," one said, his jaw set. Halden hissed between his teeth, muttering, "Fools, all of you!" Yet he did not move to stop them. And so the slow procession began. Bramble strained to rise, his legs trembling beneath his great weight. Callan clung to his side, murmuring encouragement with every step. "One more, Bramble. Just one more." The bull's breath came in labored huffs, his body swaying dangerously, yet he pressed on, guided by something beyond sheer instinct. The villagers followed, a mix of fear and awe pulling them along the winding dirt path. Dust rose around their feet, the sun dipping low and painting the world in shades of gold and shadow. Every stumble of the bull sent hearts leaping, but still he moved forward, his muzzle brushing against Callan's shoulder as though drawing strength from the boy's presence. Behind them, unseen among the trees, a figure crouched. Rael. His lips curled into a grim smile as he watched the struggling procession. The shadows of the branches cloaked him, but his eyes gleamed with satisfaction. He leaned against the rough bark, arms crossed, certain of the outcome. The bull's strength was draining, every step a fight against the poison coursing through him. Soon enough, Rael thought, Bramble would collapse, and with him, the strange hope the villagers clung to. Callan, unaware of the eyes watching from the tree line, pressed forward with all the quiet courage of youth. He kept his voice low, steady, a lifeline for the beast beside him. The villagers trailed behind, torn between grief and the faint glimmer of revelation. Each step forward deepened the mystery, sharpening the question that none dared speak aloud. Where was the bull leading them, and what truth would they find at the river's edge? None of them realized that Rael himself was watching from the tree line, a grim smile on his face, certain the bull would collapse before they uncovered the truth. Bramble staggered, his legs buckling beneath his massive frame as the procession reached the soft banks of the river. The ground sloped gently down to the water, where reeds bent in the breeze, but all eyes were fixed on the bull. With a groan that trembled through his chest, Bramble stumbled sideways. Callan dropped to his knees before him, both arms bracing against the beast's chest, as if his small body could keep him from collapsing. "Rest," Callan whispered, his voice hoarse, urgent. His palm pressed hard against Bramble's hide, feeling the faint thrum of a slowing heartbeat. "Just rest here." The bull lowered himself heavily onto the ground, the earth shuddering with the weight. His horns dug shallow furrows into the soil as his head sagged. For a breathless moment, the villagers thought this was the end, that Bramble had chosen this spot to die. But then his foreleg shifted, scraping at the dirt, slow and deliberate. His muzzle pressed downward, nudging the soil as though pointing. Callan froze, staring. The meaning struck him with a sharp clarity. "Here," he said, his voice breaking. "He wants us to dig here." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Some muttered in disbelief, but one of the younger men, Darren, stepped forward. "The boy was right before," he said, his hands already clawing at the dirt. "If the bull says dig, we dig." Others hesitated only a moment before joining in. Fingers, shovels, whatever tools they had. Soil flew as the men dug feverishly. The ground was soft from the river's dampness, and soon the earth gave way with a dull scrape against something solid. "Wait," Merrick barked, raising a hand. His voice trembled despite his attempt at authority. "Careful." The men slowed, brushing away soil with their palms until shapes emerged. A shard of clay, then another, and then the rim of a broken jar, half buried, its sides cracked but still holding form. The digging stopped altogether as a foul, acrid odor seeped into the air. The men recoiled at once, covering their noses. The smell was unmistakable, sharp, bitter, unnatural. Poison. For a long moment, no one spoke. The river's murmur filled the silence, joined only by Bramble's shallow breathing. Finally, Halden, his face pale as ash, whispered, "So it's true. Someone's been feeding him poison." The words hit the villagers like stones. Anger surged in their chests, hot and immediate. "Rail!" someone spat. "It must be Rail!" Others nodded fiercely, their eyes burning with fury. "We've all heard the talk," another man growled. "He's hated us since the last harvest." But Merrick raised his staff sharply. "We can't condemn a man without proof beyond suspicion," he warned, though his own gaze lingered on the broken jar with dread. "Proof?" Darren barked. His voice cracked with raw emotion. "What more proof do we need? The bull's dying because of this, because someone couldn't bear to see Dunswell thrive." The men argued, voices rising in waves of grief and rage. Callan, however, heard none of it. He was bent over Bramble, his small hand resting against the beast's muzzle. Bramble's eyes fluttered weakly open, and he pressed his heavy head into the boy's lap with a final surge of effort. Callan gasped softly, his vision blurring as tears spilled down his cheeks. He understood now. The bull had led them here on purpose, not for his sake, but for theirs. His death was not just an end. It was a revelation. "You showed them," Callan whispered through his tears, stroking Bramble's muzzle. "You showed me. You didn't let the lie live." His chest ached with the weight of the moment, and in that ache, a vow was born. "I promise, your truth will not be buried with you." The villagers, hearing the boy's trembling words, fell silent. Men who had spent years laboring beside Bramble bowed their heads, their grief unmasked at last. Some wept openly, shoulders shaking. They had lost more than a bull. They had lost a partner, a guardian of their fields, and now realized the depth of betrayal that had brought him low. The riverbank held them in solemn stillness until the stillness was broken by a sudden shout from the trees. "There!" Heads snapped up. From the shadow of the woods, figures emerged, men with hard faces, led by one they all knew too well. Rail stepped forward, his expression twisted with fury. At his side, 3 of his farmhands held crude weapons, nothing more than clubs and hooks, but their intent was unmistakable. "You think you've uncovered something," Rail sneered, his voice carrying across the riverbank. "But all you've found is broken earth and your own foolishness." The villagers shifted uneasily, yet grief hardened into defiance in their eyes. Bram stepped forward, his broad frame like a wall before the others. "We found more than that," he said, his voice rumbling low. He jabbed a finger toward the shattered jar. "We found proof of your poison." Rail's face twisted. For an instant he faltered, but then his sneer returned. "Lies. You'd pin any misfortune on me to guard your pride. Do you think a few shards of clay prove anything?" "You deny it?" Halden asked, his tone sharp. His knuckles whitened against his staff. Rail's eyes flared with anger, his voice rising. "I deny nothing and confess nothing. You are weak, clinging to beasts as though they are kin. Dunswell's pride was bound to fall, with or without my hand." The slip was small but heavy, and the men of Dunswell heard it. Murmurs of rage spread, their grief boiling over into a need for justice. Darren stepped forward, fists clenched. "Your own tongue betrays you, Rail." Rail's sneer faltered again, replaced by a flash of fear that hardened quickly into malice. "Enough!" he roared, signaling his men forward. "If you mean to brand me guilty, then let's see if your grief can fight steel." The standoff tightened in an instant. Villagers, unarmed but many, drew closer around Callan and Bramble. Their grief gave them strength. They would not let the boy or the bull be desecrated by violence. The river's hush became the backdrop of a storm about to break. But even Rael could see the numbers were against him. His men hesitated, their courage wilting beneath the villagers' glare. Then, with a curse under his breath, Rael turned, his face twisting with frustration. "This isn't over," he spat, before shoving back into the cover of the trees. His men followed, their threats swallowed by the forest. For a long moment, silence hung heavy once more. The villagers stood together, hearts pounding, until it was broken only by the sound of Bramble's labored breathing. Callan clutched the bull's muzzle tighter, his tears falling fast. He could feel the great heart slowing beneath his touch. "Stay," Callan whispered desperately. "Please, just stay." But Bramble's strength was gone. With one last rattling breath, his massive body shuddered and then stilled. His eyes dimmed, his weight sinking into the earth. Callan buried his face into the bull's hide, sobbing openly now. Around him, the men of Dunswell stood in a silent circle, their heads bowed, their grief transforming into solemn respect. They did not move, did not speak. They simply stood guard, sentinels of honor for the fallen beast who had revealed their betrayal with his final act. Silence fell over the riverbank as Callan wept into his hide, the men of Dunswell standing guard like sentinels of respect. The days that followed carried a weight that reshaped the village forever. Bramble's body lay in the barn through the night, covered with a heavy woolen cloth. The scent of hay and earth filled the air, but underneath lingered something heavier, the stillness of a life that had once filled the fields with power and presence. At dawn, the men of Dunswell gathered, their boots sinking into the damp soil as they stood in silence. No one needed to call them. Word of Bramble's death had passed through the village like a storm, and every man knew he must stand there. Callan stood at the front, his face pale but steady. His hands, once small and clumsy around ropes and tools, now gripped the wooden spade with a firmness that seemed older than his years. The elders had asked him to choose the place where Bramble would rest, and without hesitation he pointed to the great oak tree at the center of the village. Its roots stretched deep, and its branches spread wide, as though it had always been watching over them. "Here," Callan said simply, his voice low but certain. "This is where he belongs." The men obeyed. They set their tools into the ground, cutting through the earth together. Their shovels struck stone and clay, yet not one man complained. Sweat soaked through shirts and hands blistered, but still they worked. Some muttered prayers beneath their breath. Others dug in silence, their eyes fixed on the ground as though they feared looking at the boy who had loved the bull more than anyone. Callan worked beside them, his frame slight, his arms thin, yet he never paused. The villagers exchanged glances, realizing that his grief was carried not in tears, but in the stubborn strength of each strike into the soil. By midday, the grave was ready. It stretched deep beneath the roots of the oak, wide enough to hold the great beast who had once carried burdens heavier than most men could lift. When they finally brought Bramble forward, every step felt heavier than the last. The bull's massive body rested on a wooden cart, pulled slowly by the strongest men of the village. Their faces were drawn, eyes red from sleepless nights, yet they moved as though guided by duty more than strength. When the cart reached the oak, the men halted. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was crushing, broken only by the rustle of leaves above. Then one of the elders, his voice trembling, whispered, "It is time." Together they lowered Bramble into the grave. The ropes strained, and the ground trembled as his weight settled into the earth. The sight of it broke something inside the men. These were men who rarely showed emotion, who faced storms, hunger, and hard winters without complaint. Yet now tears streamed down their cheeks openly. Some knelt in the dirt, hands pressed to the ground as if begging the bull's spirit to remain. Others shared stories in hoarse voices, how Bramble had pulled wagons through floods, broken ice with his horns to save cattle, and even stood guard against wolves when the fields were threatened. One man, his beard streaked with gray, lifted his hand and said, "This beast was no beast. He was our protector." His voice cracked, and he looked toward Callan. "And this boy? He was the only one who saw it first." Callan stood beside the grave, his eyes fixed on Bramble. His lips trembled, but he did not cry. He had cried already in silence when no one could see. Now he stood tall, his back straight, his expression unyielding. To the men around him, it seemed as though the boy carried the grief of them all, holding it inside his small frame so they would not collapse under it. His silence spoke louder than any word. When the last handful of soil was laid upon Bramble, the villagers gathered around the mound. A hush fell, and even the wind seemed to still. Then, one by one, the men removed their hats and bowed their heads. For the first time in Dunswell's history, a funeral was held not for a man, but for a bull. And yet, it felt more sacred than any burial before. As evening settled, the villagers placed a lantern at the base of the oak. Its golden light flickered against the fresh earth, casting long shadows across the faces of the mourners. One of the younger men whispered to another, "This is not just a grave, this is a promise." The words spread quickly, murmured from one man to the next, until they became a vow shared by all. Bramble's death would not go unanswered. Later, when most of the villagers had returned to their homes, the elders gathered near the grave with Callan. Their voices were low, heavy with guilt. The oldest among them, his hands shaking as he leaned on his staff, spoke. "We wronged you, boy. We doubted the bond you shared with him. We let our pride blind us." He paused, his eyes wet. "But never again. Bramble's death was not in vain. His spirit will guide us now, through you." Callan lowered his gaze, his voice soft but steady. "I don't want revenge. I want remembrance. Let him not be forgotten." The elder placed a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder. "He will not. We will make sure of it." And so they did. In the days that followed, the men carved a stone from the nearby quarry. It was heavy and rough at first, but together they shaped it, smoothing its sides, chiseling the likeness of Bramble into its face. His broad horns, his strong stance, his steady eyes, all captured in stone so that no man, no child, no generation would ever forget. When it was finished, They set it beside the oak, above the mound. Each year, when the leaves turned and the harvest was stored, the men of Dunswell gathered beneath that tree. They placed food, grain, and small trinkets at the stone, not as offerings to a beast, but as signs of respect for the protector they had lost. They told stories to the younger boys, tales of Bramble's strength and loyalty, teaching them that true power was not in force, but in devotion. For Callan, the bond he had shared with Bramble became the foundation of his life. As he grew, he carried himself with the same quiet strength the bull had shown. Men who once dismissed him now sought his counsel. They followed his lead, not because he demanded it, but because they saw in him the reflection of what they had all witnessed, a loyalty unbroken, even in death. Rail never returned to Dunswell. His name became a shadow, whispered only as a warning to future generations. "Do not betray trust," fathers told their sons. "Remember Rail, and remember Bramble." Years passed, and Callan grew into a man. His hair darkened, his frame broadened, yet he never forgot the day he had stood beside the oak as a boy, carrying the grief of his people. The lesson Bramble left him guided every choice he made. When disputes rose in the village, Callan listened more than he spoke, just as Bramble had stood silent yet resolute. When hardships threatened them, he reminded the men that strength was not measured by anger but by loyalty. And so, the boy who once sat silently beside a dying bull became the man who carried his spirit forward, ensuring that Dunswell would never forget the day when silence revealed everything. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores powerful themes of empathy, loss, and the profound unspoken connections between humans and animals. This narrative aims to highlight the extraordinary emotional bonds that exist, inspiring compassion and a deeper appreciation for the unspoken truths that can bring a community to its knees.